I want to begin with an image, not a metaphor exactly, something more precise than that. Teen to first, something closer to a clinical description of a psychological reality that, once you see it clearly, reframes everything else about the narcissistic dynamic in a way that is both intellectually illuminating and, for many survivors, profoundly releasing. And a person who, at a very early age, before they had the language, the cognitive development, or the relational safety required to process what was happening to them, received a message. Not always a spoken message. Often a felt one, conveyed through absence rather than presence, through conditional approval, rather than unconditional love, through the subtle but devastating communication that who they authentically were was either too much, not enough, temple to the people whose acceptance they depended on for their psychological and physical survival, gelled with the extraordinary adaptive intelligence that all children possess, responding to that message in the only way available to them. Not by healing the wound, they had neither the resources nor the permission for that, but by constructing something over it, a self, performed, managed, carefully calibrated version of a person designed to be acceptable where the authentic self was not, designed to attract the admiration, the attention, and the validation that the authentic self was told it did not deserve. This is the mask, and I want you to hold that origin story carefully as we proceed, because it is the single most important thing to understand about it. The mask is not, in the way we typically imagine deception, a deliberate or fully conscious construction. The narcissist did not sit down one day and decide to build the false self to manipulate the people around them. Class, what happened was far more complex, far more tragic, and far more psychologically understandable than that framing allows. The mask was a survival response. It was the psyche's most intelligent available answer to an environment that communicated clearly and repeatedly that survival required performance, that love was conditional. Self, with its needs, its vulnerabilities, its genuine emotional texture, was a liability rather than an asset. Particularly Donald Winnicott, described this split between the authentic self and the performed self with extraordinary precision. Called it the distinction between the true self and the false self. And he was careful to note that the development of a false self is not inherently pathological. We all, to varying degrees, develop social presentations that differ from our most private internal experience. Twerps distinguishes the narcissistic configuration as the degree to which the false self has not just supplemented the true self, but has entirely replaced it as the operating center of the personality. The true self, the authentic, vulnerable, needing, genuinely human interior, has not just been concealed. It has been so thoroughly suppressed, so consistently denied, so completely locked away that the narcissist themselves has lost reliable access to it. This is the interior reality that the mask is protecting, not just from the world, but from the narcissist themselves. Debating, structurally different from ordinary social performance or even deliberate deception. The narcissist is not simply hiding something from you. They are hiding something from themselves. They are maintaining a construction that serves the dual purpose of presenting an acceptable face to the world and preventing the narcissist from having to encounter the shame-saturated, terrifyingly vulnerable interior that lies beneath it. And what is that interior saturated with? What is the fundamental emotional experience that the entire narcissistic structure, the grandiosity, the entitlement, the manipulation, the religings, the need for constant external validation, the rage when that validation is withheld? What is all of it ultimately defending against? Shame, not guilt, which is the painful but ultimately productive experience of having done something wrong, and which carries within it the possibility of repair and genuine accountability. Categorically different. Shame is something categorically different. Shame is the experience of being something wrong, of being, at the level of one's essential self, defective, unlovable, and unworthy of belonging. It is, as the researcher Brené Brown has described it, the most primitive and most devastating of all human emotional experiences, because it does not attack what you did. It attacks what you are. Narcissistic personality structure is, at its deepest psychological level, an elaborate, comprehensive, and extraordinarily costly defense against the intolerable experience of that shame and behavior that confuses and damages the people around the narcissist. The devaluation, the gaslighting, the projection, the rage, the entitlement can be understood with clinical precision as a mechanism for keeping that shame at a distance, for ensuring that the constructed self remains intact, remains dominant, remains the version of reality that both the narcissist and the people around them are required to accept and confirm. The mask, then, is not a disguise worn by a villain. Activities, or my person who, at the deepest level of their psychological experience, believes that, without it, they would not survive being truly seen. Understanding the mask does not obligate you to excuse what was done behind eye, though, but it does give you something. The narcissist will spend their entire life trying to prevent you from having the complete, unobstructed view of what you are actually dealing with. Clarity is not just understanding, it is the foundation of every freedom that follows. Here is the expanded segment for key point 2. There is a moment. And if you have been in a relationship with a narcissist, I believe you will recognize it, the instant I describe it, where something shifts. It is not always dramatic, does not always announce itself with the clarity that, in retrospect, you might wish it had, but it is distinct. It has a specific quality that separates it from every other moment in the dynamic. It is the moment you stopped believing the performance. Some part of you, perhaps before your conscious mind had fully caught up, saw past the constructed self and made contact, however briefly, however unsettlingly, with what was actually there. You have experienced it as a sudden, inexplicable chill in the middle of an ordinary conversation. Micro-expression that crossed their face so quickly you almost missed it. Something raw and unguarded that was immediately replaced by the mask, but not quite quickly enough. Internal stillness in which you heard yourself think, with a clarity that felt both revelatory and terrifying. I don't know who this person actually is. Time, most people don't recognize at first, or perhaps it arrived more gradually. A slow, accumulating weight of small inconsistencies, small moments where the performance slipped just enough that the architecture beneath it became briefly, unmistakably visible. Tivert arrived for you. I want to examine what happened on their side of that moment, because the narcissist's experience of being seen, of having their mask penetrated by someone who is supposed to remain a confirming, reflect, to apply private I am presence in their relational world is one of the most psychologically significant events in the entire dynamic, and understanding it with precision gives the survivors something invaluable. Next, at first, it gives them context for behaviors that, without this understanding, can appear random, disproportionate, or simply incomprehensible. Let's begin with what the narcissist actually perceives in the moment of exposure, because it is important to understand that the narcissist's awareness of being seen is not always, or even primarily, a conscious cognitive event. It does not necessarily arrive as a clear thought. They know it experience. It arrives more often as a somatic experience, a sudden internal alarm, the visceral recognition that the relational environment has become unsafe in a way that the constructed self's usual management tools are not immediately equipped to address. The body knows before the mind catches up. Between the body's alarm and the mind's defensive response, something genuinely unguarded passes across the narcissist. A flash of the thing the mask was built to conceal. What you are witnessing in that flash is not the authentic self emerging with warmth and vulnerability. So I have about that, because there's a tendency among survivors, particularly in the early stages of recovery, to interpret those unguarded moments as glimpses of the real person beneath the mask, and to invest enormous hope in those glimpses. Tozer is something closer to the opposite. You are witnessing the terror that lives at the foundation of the constructed self. The raw, barely contained panic of a psychological system that has just detected a fundamental threat to its most critical defense structure. Think about what the penetration of the mask actually represents from the narcissist's internal perspective. Their entire relational world is organized around the maintenance of the constructed self as the operative reality. Again, and that every relationship they are in, Every interaction they manage, every social environment they navigate is structured around the implicit requirement that the mask is accepted as real, that the performance is taken for the person. Evil in their life are not, at the level of their psychological function, fully separate human beings with independent perceptions. They are, as we discussed in our earlier conversation, mirrors, reflecting surfaces whose primary relational function is to confirm the constructed self's version of reality. When you see through the mask, you stop functioning as a mirror. Narcissistic system that has lost a mirror does not simply adjust to a new relational dynamic. It experiences the loss as a structural threat because the mirror was not providing a luxury, the warmth of being seen favorably, the pleasure of external validation. The mirror was providing a necessity, continuous external confirmation, without which the constructed self cannot maintain its coherence, cannot sustain its dominance, cannot continue to suppress the shame-saturated interior it was built to cover. This is why the narcissist's response to the moment of exposure is so frequently disproportionate to the apparent trigger. From the outside, the response can appear bewildering. An eruption of rage, a sudden and total withdrawal, an immediate pivot to aggression or devaluation in response to what seemed, on the surface, like a minor interaction. But the response is not disproportionate to the actual trigger. It is precisely proportionate to the internal experience of the narcissist, which is not mild discomfort or social embarrassment. David, of the deepest terror in their psychological architecture, the terror of being truly seen, of edge, Italian, the constructed self, authority over reality challenged by someone who is no longer willing to confirm it. There is something else that happens in the moment of exposure that deserves careful examination, something that has profound implications for the survivor's understanding of the entire subsequent dynamic. Ties at first, when the narcissist registers that you see through the mask, they do not simply experience threat. They experience you differently, fundamentally, irrevocably differently. Because up until that moment, don't recognize at first, you occupied a specific functional position in their relational world, the position of confirming mirror, of reliable supply source, of someone whose perception of them was safely, usefully organized around the constructed self's requirements. Demonstrate that your perception has penetrated beyond the construction. That position is vacated. Question of what position you now occupy, threat, enemy, target for neutralization, is answered with a speed and a completeness that can leave the survivor feeling as though they have, overnight, become a stranger to someone they knew intimately. That is in a very real sense exactly what happened. Not because you changed, but because your function changed. And for a system that relates to people entirely through the lens of function, a change in function is a change in identity. The moment you saw through the mask was the moment the entire dynamic changed, not because you did something wrong, but because you did something the narcissist's entire psychological system was designed to prevent. You saw truly, person who has been seen truly by a system built entirely on not being seen does not become less threatening with time. They become more, because the truth, once witnessed, does not wait politely to be forgotten. We have now arrived at the psychological center of this entire speech, the point around which everything else orbits. The answer to the question that the title itself is ultimately asking, why does your clarity haunt them? Ties is, why does the knowledge that you saw through the mask not simply fade with time, not simply get absorbed into the narcissist's relentless forward momentum of new supply and new narratives and new constructed realities? Why does it persist? Taunting his dowels, why does it follow them? Why, of all the injuries and disruptions the narcissist encounters in their relational life, does being genuinely seen by someone who then refused to unsee it occupy such a specific and irresolvable place in their psychological experience? Thing, now boo, don't recognize at first. The answer is shame. But I want to go much deeper than that word typically allows, because shame is one of those terms that gets used with such frequency in the therapeutic and recovery communities that it has, for many people, lost some of its precise clinical weight. When I say that shame is at the core of the narcissistic personality structure, I am not offering you a vague psychological generalization. I am pointing at something extraordinarily specific, something with a developmental origin, a neurobiological signature, a characteristic phenomenology, a way of being experienced from the inside that is categorically different from every other difficult emotion in the human repertoire. Station was exceeds for let me try to map it as precisely as I can. Shame, in its toxic form, the form that developmental trauma produces, and that the narcissistic personality structure is organized entirely around defending against, is not an emotion about behavior and about existence. The distinction is critical. When we feel guilt, we are experiencing the painful but ultimately navigatable sense that we has done something that violated our own values or caused harm to someone else. Guilt is about action. Because it is about action, it contains within it the seeds of repair, the possibility of acknowledgement, of making amends, of aligning future behavior more closely with our values. Guilt, however uncomfortable, is a productive emotion. It serves the relational and moral development of the person who experiences it. Toxic shame operates on an entirely different register. It does not say you did something wrong. It says you are something wrong. Indicated is the experience installed most powerfully in early childhood, when the psyche is at its most permeable, and the relational environment is at its most formative, of one's very existence being the problem. The self, with its needs, its vulnerabilities, its genuine emotional reality, being fundamentally defective. Unlovable not because of anything it has done, but because of what it essentially is. Toriel didn't recognize at first. The neurobiologist and trauma researcher Alan Shore has written extensively about how early relational experiences of shame, particularly those involving misattunement between caregiver and child, repeated experiences of emotional abandonment, trains where the child's authentic expression was met with rejection or humiliation, become encoded not just psychologically but neurobiologically. Shame of this depth and this origin is not simply a thought or a feeling that can be reasoned away. It is a state, body, whole nervous system state of collapse and concealment that the organism will mobilize enormous resources to avoid re-experiencing. And here is the precise mechanism that connects all of this to the narcissistic personality structure. Toxic shame is sufficiently early, sufficiently pervasive, and sufficiently unresolved. When there is no relational safety available in which the shame can be witnessed, metabolized, and gradually released, Div does not simply learn to live with it. IT builds against it. It constructs, as we discussed in the previous section, an alternative self. Constructed shame, constructed identity that serves as both a concealment of the toxic shame and a perpetual compulsive attempt to generate the external validation that was never reliably provided internally. And the personality, the grandiosity, the entitlement, the devaluation of others, the rage when challenged, the insatiable need for admiration, can be understood with clinical precision. An actuator of this anti-shame architecture. The grandiosity is the constructed self's assertion of superiority over the worthlessness the shame insists upon. The entitlement is the demand for treatment that contradicts the shame's verdict. Devaluation of others is the projection of the shame onto external targets. If I can make you feel worthless, I can temporarily relocate the worthlessness from inside me to outside me. The narcissistic rage is the system's emergency response when the shame threatens to break through the defenses. Of constant admiration is the perpetual, never satisfied attempt to drown out the shame's voice with the noise of external validation. Now, and this is where the connection to your seeing through the mask becomes psychologically precise. What happens when someone penetrates the constructed self and makes genuine perceptual contact with what is beneath it? When the mirror becomes a witness, when the person who is supposed to reflect the constructed self's version of reality back with confirming accuracy instead demonstrates, through their seeing, that the construction is visible as a construction, the primary function of the narcissistic personality structure, the function of keeping the toxic shame at a distance, of maintaining the constructed self as the operative reality, of ensuring that neither the narcissist nor anyone in their relational world has direct access to the shame-saturated interior, is compromised. Not destroyed, dissolved, but compromised in a way that the system's usual defensive operations cannot fully repair, because you saw it, and the narcissist knows you saw it, and the knowledge that you saw it, and the knowledge that you saw it, that somewhere in the world there exists a person whose perception penetrated the construction and made contact with the terrifying reality beneath it, is not a knowledge that can be simply overwritten by new supply, new relationships, or new narratives. It is a splinter, lodged in a place that the constructed self's management tools cannot reach, insistent, surfacing in unguarded moments, with a persistence that is directly proportional to how completely and how accurately you saw. This is why the narcissist's response to being seen is never indifference. Difference would require that the seeing was inconsequential. But the seeing is not inconsequential. It is, from the perspective of the narcissist, psychological survival architecture, one of the most consequential things that can happen to them. Your clarity did not just discomfort them. And the deepest, oldest, most foundational terror in their entire psychological experience. The terror of the shame being real, being visible, and being witnessed by someone who cannot be entirely controlled or silenced. The narcissist does not fear your anger. They do not fear your grief. They do not even ultimately fear your absence. What they fear, with a depth and a persistence that will follow them long after you are gone, is your clarity. Because your clarity is the one thing their entire psychological architecture was built to prevent, and the one thing it has absolutely no mechanism for undoing. You saw the shame beneath the mask, and shame that has been truly witnessed by someone who then refused to pretend they hadn't seen it does not sleep quietly. It haunts. There is a concept in literature and in philosophy that I want to borrow for a moment. To first, not because we are in the business of metaphor for its own sake, but because it captures something about the narcissist's post-exposure psychological experience with a precision that purely clinical language sometimes struggles to achieve. That concept is the haunting, and I want to examine it not as a dramatic flourish, not as a satisfying piece of poetic justice for the survivor who has endured significant harm, but as a psychologically accurate description of what actually happens inside the narcissist's internal world when a person who saw through their mask exits the dynamic or is pushed out of it and takes their clarity with them. To understand why the haunting is real, why it is not wishful thinking on the part of the survivor, not a comforting narrative constructed to make sense of pain, but a genuine and clinically explicable feature of the narcissist's ongoing psychological experience. We need to return to something we established in our previous section. Toxic shame at the depth and origin that characterizes the narcissistic personality structure is not a thought or an emotion that can be reasoned away or overridden by positive experience. It is a state, and neurobiologically encoded state of self-annihilating worthlessness that the entire narcissistic structure was constructed to suppress, deny, and defend against. We also established that your seeing through the mask compromised the primary defensive function of that structure, that it introduced into the narcissist's carefully managed psychological system a specific irresolvable element, the knowledge that someone saw truly complete entity that the system's usual tools cannot metabolize or neutralize. Now I want to examine what happens to that element over time, because this is where the psychology becomes both fascinating and, for survivors who have spent time wondering whether any of what happened to them registered with the person who caused it, genuinely significant. The narcissist, in the aftermath of your seeing, will do what the narcissistic system always does when confronted with a threat it cannot directly neutralize. It will attempt to manage the threat through the mechanisms available to it. Supply will be pursued and secured because new supply temporarily elevates the constructed self's sense of power and validity, and that elevation briefly mutes the internal alarm you're seeing activated. Tov will be constructed, one in which your perception is reframed as delusional, vindictive, or the product of your own psychological instability, rather than an accurate reading of their interior reality. Mirrors will be recruited, people whose confirming reflections can, for a time, drown out the echo of your witness. And for a while, these mechanisms work. Not completely, not permanently, but sufficiently. The narcissist moves forward. They peer from the outside to be entirely unaffected. They are thriving, performing, consuming new supply with their characteristic intensity. Survivor, watching this from whatever distance they have managed to establish, may conclude painfully, and with the particular desolation of feeling that their suffering simply did not matter, that they were wrong, that the seeing did not register, that the narcissist's apparent imperviousness to consequence is evidence that nothing, including being seen clearly, touches them. Tory of war and tracting directly and with great care, because it is one of the most calm, damaging misreads available in the post-relationship period. And it is a misread that the narcissist's performance of imperviousness is specifically, if not always consciously, designed to produce. The performance of being unaffected is not the same as being unaffected. Activities, and to the narcissist's capacity to perform imperviousness, to project an image of total invulnerability, of someone for whom your seeing was merely an inconvenience quickly superseded by superior supply, is itself a function of the mask. To self that managed their presentation throughout the relationship is managing it now. The performance of not being haunted is itself a performance, first. And like all performances, it is most convincingly maintained in public, in social contexts, in the visible spaces where the narcissist's image management operates most efficiently. What happens in the private, unperformed spaces between supply hits in the sleepless hours that no amount of external validation can fully colonize. In the unguarded instance, when the constructed self's vigilance momentarily relaxes, is a different matter entirely. Ace, the splinter of your seeing makes itself known, not necessarily as a conscious thought about you specifically. Div manicular don't recognize it first, more often as a diffuse but insistent internal disturbance, a restlessness that cannot be entirely attributed to external circumstances. Twong, quality of unease that surfaces precisely in the moments of greatest apparent triumph, because triumph, for the narcissist, always carries within it the shadow of the shame it was designed to defeat, since your scene has a witness attached to it, a specific, real, remembered human being, whose perception penetrated the construction and saw the shame operating beneath the grandiosity. This is the haunting. It is not dramatic, does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a visitation with clear edges and a recognizable form. It arrives as a texture, tabelausen, frequency disturbance, in the narcissist's internal atmosphere that new supply can temporarily quiet but never permanently silence, because what you saw cannot be unseen. Teen. The narcissist, whatever their performance to the contrary, knows this with a certainty that lives in the body rather than the mind, in the nervous system's memory of the moment the mirror became a witness. At first there is a further dimension to this haunting that deserves to be named, and it is perhaps the most psychologically precise element of the entire analysis. The haunting is not just about what you saw, as about what you're seeing represents as a permanent feature of reality. Before you saw through the mask, the narcissist's constructed world was, in a meaningful sense, complete. Every person in their relational orbit was either a confirming mirror or a dismissed irrelevance. The constructed self's version of reality was the operative reality in every context that mattered to them. Turbode, choosing but choose something that world had no architecture to contain, a genuinely independent perception, a consciousness that evaluated them and arrived at an accurate conclusion that the constructed self did not authorize and cannot revise, turning more in the world as a person who knows, not suspects, not theorizes, knows, with the particular certainty that comes from having been close enough, long enough, and perceptive enough to see past the performance to the performer. Knowledge residing in a consciousness entirely outside the narcissist's control is not something the constructed self can manage, reframe, or neutralize. It can attempt to discredit it, to bury it under new narratives and new supply, but it cannot undo it, cannot reach into your pee. But Pessinen, revise what you saw, cannot retroactively restore the mirror that became a witness. The haunting is not your gift to them, and it is not your revenge upon them. It is simply the inevitable consequence of truth existing in a system built entirely on the suppression of it. You saw clearly. You carried that clarity out of the dynamic intact, somewhere in the unguarded spaces between their performances. The knowledge of your seeing lives, persistent, irresolvable, and entirely beyond their control. That is not poetic justice. That is just what happens when someone finally tells the truth about a lie that took a lifetime to construct. We have established that your seeing through the mask is not a neutral event in the narcissist psychological experience. Tourist, we have established that it activates the deepest shame-based terror in their internal architecture, and that it produces a haunting that new supply and new narratives can temporarily quiet, but never permanently resolve. Brahms, now to turn to something that is critically important for survivors to understand, not as abstract psychology, but as practical. Protective knowledge that applies directly to the lived experience of what happens after the seeing occurs and the dynamic begins to shift. When the narcissist registers that their mask has been penetrated, when they understand, at whatever level of consciousness is available to them, that someone in their relational world sees them truly and accurately, they do not sit with that knowledge. They reflect on it. They do not reflect on it. They do not, in any meaningful sense, metabolize it. First, what they do with a speed and a comprehensiveness that can leave the survivor genuinely breathless is move immediately and decisively to destroy the credibility of the person who saw them. This is the smear campaign. It's in it here, not in its surface mechanics, which survivors are already painfully familiar with, but in its deep psychological function. Because when you understand what the smear campaign is actually doing, at the level of the narcissist's internal psychological economy, it transforms from an act of cruelty into something far more revealing. It becomes a diagnostic, full disclosure of exactly how threatened the narcissist is by what you saw and exactly how desperately the constructed self needs your witness to be discredited before it can take root in the shared reality. Let me build this carefully. The narcissist's constructed self, as we have established, depends entirely on the management of external perception. It does not just function internally as a suppression mechanism for the toxic shame that lives beneath it. It functions relationally as a managed presentation that requires the confirming perception of others to maintain its operative authority. Constructed self is not simply something the narcissist believes about themselves in isolation. It is something that exists in the social world, sustained by the collective perception of the people in the narcissist's relational orbit, which means that a threat to the constructed self is never purely internal. It is always simultaneously a social threat. A threat to the version of reality that the social world has been carefully cultivated to confirm. When you see through the mask, particularly when you begin to name what you saw, whether to mutual friends, within family systems, in therapeutic contexts, or simply in the increasing confidence and clarity of your own behavior. These petting the narcissist's internal experience, you are threatening the social architecture of their constructed reality. You are introducing into their carefully managed relational world an alternative narrative, one that particular authority of coming from someone who was close enough, long enough, to have genuine observational access to what the mask conceals. Term can arise at first, and the narcissist's response to this social threat is as psychologically predictable as it is personally devastating for the survivor who experiences it. They get there first, before your narrative can establish itself, before your perception can be received and evaluated by the people in the shared social world. The narcissist moves to preemptively dismantle your credibility as a witness, to ensure that when your account arrives, if it arrives, it lands in a relational environment that has already been prepared to receive it with suspicion, dismissal, or active hostility. The specific content of the smear campaign is always, and I mean always, carefully calibrated to the particular vulnerabilities and insecurities that the narcissist cataloged during the relationship. They know your history. They know your wounds of your past, your behavior, or your psychology. taken out of context, selectively emphasized, or outright fabricated, are most likely to generate doubt about your reliability as a narrator of your own experience. Deviations leveled in a smear campaign are never random. They are targeted, engineered from intimate knowledge people don't recognize at first, which means that the very closeness you brought to the relationship, the genuine vulnerability and self-disclosure that are the natural expressions of authentic human connection, becomes in the smear campaign the material used to discredit you. This is one of the most psychologically brutal dimensions of narcissistic abuse, not just because of the reputational damage it produces, and not just because of the particular loneliness of watching people you trusted choose the narcissist's narrative over your reality, but because it represents the weaponize it had. But because it represents the weaponize it, NC itself, the things you shared from your most authentic and vulnerable self, shared in the trust that they would be held with care, are now being deployed against you as evidence of your instability and attenuation. Your emotional depth is manipulation. Your emotional depth is reframed as volatility. Your clarity is reframed as delusion. Your witness is reframed as vendetta. L named something about this reframing that rarely gets said directly in the conversation around narcissistic abuse recovery. The reason the narcissist smear campaign so frequently lands, the reason mutual friends, family members, social acquaintances so often accept the narcissist narrative over the survivors, is not simply that the narcissist is a skilled manipulator, though they often are. The narcissist narrative is, in a very specific sense, more comfortable for the audience to receive. The narcissist narrative says that the person making difficult claims about their character is unstable, vindictive, or disturbed at first, and that narrative is far easier to accept than the alternative, which requires the audience to confront the possibility that someone they like, someone who performs warmth and charm with considerable skill, is capable of the sustained, sophisticated harm that the survivor is describing. People do not generally want to update their perception of someone they have found likable. The cognitive and relational cost of doing so is high, and the narcissist smear campaign is, among other things, but cost a strategic reduction of that cost, an offering of an easier story that allows the audience to maintain their comfortable perception of the narcissist while simultaneously explaining away the survivor's uncomfortable testimony. But here's what I want you to hold with as much steadiness as you can locate in the midst of the particular devastation that the smear campaign produces. The campaign is not evidence that you were wrong, it is evidence that you were right. A person who had nothing to hide would have no need to destroy the credibility of the person who looked too closely. Constricted self that was not concealing something genuinely threatening would have no need to neutralize the witness before the witness could speak. The ferocity of the narcissist's response to your seeing is not proof of your unreliability. Fiction available of exactly how accurately you saw, and actually how much the constructed self needs that accuracy to be buried before it can do any further damage to the carefully managed fiction that the narcissist's entire psychological survival depends upon. Though wearing is not power. It is panic wearing the costume of offense. It is the constructed self's most aggressive defense mechanism activating in direct proportion to the magnitude of the threat your clarity represents. To net as defense, as the frightened, desperate move of a psychological system that has been genuinely destabilized by your witness, does not make the experience of it less painful, but it does make it legible. Transforms an experience that can feel from the inside like being erased into something you can read accurately for what it is. The narcissist did not launch a campaign against you because you were a threat to their happiness. Taken me a they are mantra. They are reducing because you are a threat to their fiction. And a person who needs to destroy your credibility to protect their story is already in that very need. Told you everything you needed to know about which one of you was telling the truth.